Thank you. Thanks very much for coming. I saw some of you were here 10 minutes before. And that's very much appreciated. I've got a bit of a schedule, or what I thought would have been the schedule, but I understand we're a bit delayed now, but that's okay. This is just a broad idea of what we're going to do. Firstly, I'm going to talk a bit more about loot boxes. It's I would say it's a shorthand term that's used by many different people to describe different things. We're going to delve a little bit deeper into exactly what that means. And then the second half, I'm going to talk about the different laws and regulations that various countries have adopted in relation to loot boxes. And then, of course, like Victor has said, you're more than welcome to ask me any questions in the Q&A. I've put here a link and a password. Hopefully I can get a quiz thing to work in a few minutes. I know that mobile phones and laptops have been banned by Victor, but today you're allowed to use it for this purpose at least. So a bit of background about what we're talking about. So this is an advert for Horizon Zero Dawn, a very popular AAA game a couple of years ago. But what I want to focus here is on this game disc. Now, video games used to just sell the game disc. That is how video game companies made money. They sold you the disc, or well, in the past you had cards and whatnot. But basically, it is a license to play that video game, and everyone more or less paid the same amount of money to buy a copy of the software. Of course, if you buy it later on secondhand, it might be cheaper. But the idea was the video games were monetized through the sale of the software. Of course, now you can buy the software digitally on Steam, for example. You don't necessarily need to buy the physical disc anymore. We also have other video games like World of Warcraft that didn't rely on selling the software to monetize, and instead they offered you a subscription-based service. So for a certain period of time, you pay a certain amount of money in order to gain access to that particular video game. Now, those are, in my opinion, the old ways of making money through video games. Some ways to sell the software and the length of time that you're able to play the game. Now, what's more interesting with this particular advert is then you can see these other products that are offered as part of this collector's edition. So when a game company wanted to make more money from some of the more dedicated players, because all they could do was to buy a copy of the software, there were really not very many ways for that player to give more money to that company, even if they wanted to. So they started offering these collector's editions. For example, with this one, you can get an art book, or you can get, I believe this is a steel case. So instead of the usual plastic case, you can get a nicer looking metal case instead. Now, you paid extra for this collector's edition. What I want to talk about today, though, are those two things on the right-hand side. Now, those are not physical items anymore. Those are virtual items that you got as part of this collector's edition. Now, players are paying money inside video games to get virtual things. So I think we like to think that all of this microtransactions thing started with the horse armor from Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. You see those two armor, you can pay extra money in the Xbox, I think PlayStation 2 versions of the game, might be PlayStation 3, and then you can equip your horses with the gold and the silver armor. People were very angry about this particular monetization mechanic, but I actually looked back on how much it costed, and really it was €2 on the Xbox 360 and €1.55 on the PC, and people were angry about that. If you have time, I would highly recommend having a look at the GameSpot reporting on that back in 2006, just how players felt about being charged an extra €2 by a video game company. Now let's turn to loot boxes. So what's a loot box? A loot box are similar to those in-game purchases, but what's different between a loot box and those other kinds of in-game purchases is that they involve some manner of randomization. Now, I used to show a different screenshot there. I used to show the screenshot from Overwatch, because that actually looked like a box and it was called a loot box. But of course, Overwatch 2 has since removed loot boxes, as you probably know. And more recently, with the loot boxes that you can find in video games, they look less like a box. And instead, you have this, I believe this is from, what's the game now? Yes, that's it, Apex Legends, that's it. You see that it's no longer represented as a box anymore. Instead, it's this sort of triangular little robot thing that walks around. But it works on the same principle. You only have a certain probability of getting the nice items. I think I'll be right to say that the legendary item is what most players want to get. But if you buy this particular loot box, you only have a 7.4% chance of getting one, according to Electronic Arts anyway. So the issue with loot boxes is it has that randomized content, which differentiates it from other in-game purchases. With the other things, you know exactly what you're buying when you spend money. Of course, some loot boxes can be obtained for free without having to pay any money, but we tend to want to focus on the paid loot boxes. I'll go into that in a little bit. This concept is, of course, similar to gambling to many people, because a player, just like a gambler, is spending real world money into a randomized process to get rewards that are randomized. Loot box purchasing from a psychological side has also been found to be positively correlated with problem gambling. I'll go into more detail about that as well. And because of all of this randomization, it has, of course, been very controversial amongst players. Many players don't like them. There's a debate sort of in the regulatory sphere as well about these things. Now, I'll just show a quick video. Hopefully the music will come through. If not, I will play it on my laptop. Now this is, oh, and then I need to turn off the sound. There we go. This is just a normal loot box opening from that Apex Legends loot box. I think most players opening this particular loot box will be very disappointed. But you notice how there was all of that sound and all of that lighting to make you very excited about what's to come. Now, here is a different loot box opening, and I'm going to turn the music on again. You see, there's more or less the same, but of course, when this legendary item popped up, you remember that when it was flashing on the triangular thing, it flashed more brightly, and when it was revealed, there was a louder sound. Those, in my opinion, are designed to make people more excited about getting those rare items, of course. But of course, this only happens at 7.4% of the time. Now, a framework has been developed by Nelson and Grabacic at ITU, as Victor has introduced. Here's a link. I believe Victor will also share a link to that paper in the presentation, I think, next week. Basically, loot boxes have been categorized into 4 different types, depending on whether it costs real money to get into this particular mechanic. Does it cost money to engage with it? And then the second element is the reward that you obtain from the loot box. Is it embedded in the real world economy, or is it isolated and only works in the in-game economy? So by combination, basic, very basic maths, you get 4 different categories: embedded, 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 isolated, isolated, embedded, isolated, isolated. I've got some examples there on the right-hand side that you might be familiar with. But basically, just remember that if it involves real world money, when you try to obtain and start engaging with a loot box, then it's embedded. And depending on whether the reward can be transferred between you and some other player, we call that, if it is transferable, it is an embedded in terms of the reward category. And it's isolated if you can't transfer it. All right, yes. Then this is my attempt to try to get the quiz to work. Let's hope that this works. So if you go on to the quiz, all right, so you should be able to see a screenshot of the loot box of this is from Fire Emblem Heroes on the mobile platform. Now, I will tell you a little bit more about this particular loot box. So in this game, you can spend money to buy that spirit stone looking ringly rock thing to open loot boxes. However, when you get random rewards from this loot box, you cannot transfer it to other players. What kind of loot box is this? Using that categorization framework. Can you vote on it? Okay, awesome. But yes, you see most people are going over to embedded isolated. So with the first stage, this depends on, did it take real world money to engage with this mechanic? If you paid money, or if you paid money to buy a virtual currency to then use that virtual currency to buy the loot box, those are embedded as the first half. And then the second half, it depends on whether the rewards are transferable. If they are transferable to somebody else, they're embedded. If they're not transferable, they're isolated. All right, let's try a different example. There we are. Now, this is a loot box, one can call it that, from Yoshi's Woolly World or something like that. It's on the Nintendo Switch. But with this particular loot box, you obtain the virtual currency purely through gameplay. You cannot buy the virtual currency by spending money. You can only earn it by playing the game. So no real world money to engage with this mechanic. And then with the rewards, you cannot transfer it to anyone else. It stays on your user account. So yes, most people have went for the isolated. Well done, nice. Now, let's go for the third one. Now, this is the loot box from an NFT game. Now, you spend real world money to buy a loot box, real money, and then the rewards that you obtain from this loot box are NFTs. NFTs, non-fungible tokens. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, but just a quick reminder that yes, you can sell NFTs to somebody else in exchange for real world money. That's kind of the whole concept of NFTs. So what kind of loot boxes? Yes, embedding. Well done. All right. I think this concept has been conveyed. And now one final example. Now, this is a so-called social or simulated casino game. So with these games, what you can do is you can spend real money to buy poker chips or casino chips or what have you. So spending real world money, and then you can participate in these simulated gambling activities, such as, in this case, playing slots. But if you do win money, you cannot convert that money into real money. You cannot convert it back. So even if you win money, all of that money stays inside the game. And you also cannot transfer anything that you win to somebody else. What kind of loot box is this? Yes, correct, embedded, isolated. Well done. But I suppose this example is just to show that when I talk about loot boxes, I do mean these random reward mechanisms. It means some sort of in-game purchases that involve randomization. It doesn't necessarily need to be represented or portrayed as a box like it was back in Overwatch one time. All right, let's see if I can get back onto the other presentation. Awesome. Oh, it needs to now. There we are. And just another thing is we've sort of categorized loot boxes into these 4 different types. This is only one way of doing this. There are many other aspects of loot box design that can differ from one loot box to another. You know, some examples were expressed by Baloo et al. In a paper. You can find this paper quite easily if you just search Baloo and loot boxes. But basically, you know, we only talked about whether you spend real world money to engage with it and whether the rewards have real world monetary value. But there are many other ways that loot boxes can be different from one another. One main thing is, do the rewards that you obtain from loot boxes, do they offer you a competitive advantage, or are they merely cosmetic? Merely cosmetic meaning, do they only change how your characters look, or do you actually become stronger if you buy loot boxes and obtain good rewards from them? Of course, well, at least what I think want to talk about are the so-called paid loot boxes. We are basically going to disregard the isolated embedded and the isolated loot boxes. We don't think about them from now on. When I talk about loot boxes from now on, we're talking about the paid loot boxes. So the loot boxes that you have to spend real world money to buy, either directly or indirectly by buying a virtual currency to then buy the loot box. Those are the 2 things that we want to focus on, because I think the reason is that with many regulators and legislators, they're only really concerned about those 2 types of loot boxes because they involve the spending of real world money. In contrast with these 2, it's less obvious what the harm is, although of course someone might be spending a lot of time to try to obtain a free loot box. But we care about those a little bit less, and all of the research having focused on the first 2 types. Now, how prevalent are these mechanics, or how popular are they in the video games that are available? Unfortunately, at the moment, there's no research just on Spain, so I can't tell you in the most popular games in Spain how popular they are. However, I think the data from the United Kingdom or England is quite translatable. Having seen what games are popular, they do look very similar. So in 2019, a research team found that 59% of the 100 highest grossing iPhone games had loot boxes in them. We looked at the situation again in mid-2021, and we found that 77% of them had loot boxes in. Now, this is partially due to some games starting to implement loot boxes between 2019 and 2021, but also because with the 2021 study, we used a broader definition. So we looked beyond whether or not it looked like a box. We also cared about all the simulated and social casino games. The situation in China also seems to be a bit different. I think there's more social acceptance of these mechanics in East Asia. So in China, it was 91% of the 100 highest grossing games that had loot boxes in them. And when a game implements loot boxes, that tends to be what most players spend most money on. So if a game has loot boxes in, I will say that it is making most of its money with loot boxes. And this is just to illustrate the point that the 77% contain games like this one, the social casino games that we went through with the fourth example on the quiz. Some other issues related to loot boxes that I'm not going to discuss in more detail today would be scam gambling. So with the embedded and the isolated embedded loot boxes, because of the fact that you can transfer what you want from the loot box to another player, there are websites that allow you to use those virtual items as sort of a stake or as poker chips to participate in traditional gambling activities. And with those, I would say that the regulators, the gambling regulators in many countries tend to care a bit more about those, and they've actually taken action against some of those websites. But this is just another issue sort of related to loot boxes, but I'm not going to discuss in more detail today. But with games like CSGO, it is arguably allowing people who are younger than 18 to participate in traditional gambling through playing video games. You'll see that one of these websites, you can spend real money to participate in traditional gambling, or alternatively, you can use your cryptocurrencies, or you can also just put in your CSGO skins and participate in traditional gambling. So how much money is involved with loot boxes? We don't actually know. We've had some industry reports on how much money has been spent on loot boxes. They said that it was 15 billion US dollars. I've got a euro amount. I should always have the euro amount next to the actual amount that was reported. They said 15 billion. And then they also said that in 2025, this will grow to be 20 billion. I feel like they just pull this number out of them. I don't really trust them. These analytics companies, I don't think they're very reliable. I know some academic papers would say, oh, they reported this and say that's true. But I would view it with some skepticism if I'm you. However, what we do know is there have been media reports of how much individual players have spent. You know, the BBC has, for example, reported that one player in England spent about 800 euros in just 1 month on the loot boxes in one game. We also had another player who spent about 7,000 euros in 2 years just on all the FIFA games. We've also had young people, small children, stealing their parents' bank cards, credit cards to spend on loot boxes. And the most interesting thing about this one is they actually didn't get the Ronaldo, I believe it was, that they were trying to get in the FIFA games, because that was how rare it was. Spending 600 euros, it was not enough to get the character that they were looking for. We do have some idea about how much money loot boxes are generating. Now, even though this data is held, of course, by different companies across the industry, so we can't collect them together ourselves, but what we have managed to do was identify that CSGO in China was generating about 500,000 US dollars per day. Now, China is a very big country with a lot of players, but I would say perhaps the entirety of Europe will be spending a similar amount of money on this game. So we are looking at about, I would say, maybe $1.5 to $2 million a day on the loot boxes in CSGO. And we also know that with the games where the loot box items can be traded between players, they have been transacted 1.45 billion times based on data provided by Steam. So we know that they are being traded. And the value of all of those trades is more than 1 billion US dollars. So a lot of money is involved, even if gambling regulators would like to say that no money is involved. So how often do young people engage with these mechanics? I feel like we probably care a bit less about the adults, although we should definitely care about the adults. But the issue here is that loot boxes are gambling-like, but traditional gambling is, of course, only available to adults, but loot boxes are available to young people. In England, it was reported that 23% of 11 to 16-year-olds have spent real money to buy loot boxes, so 1 in 4. And this figure has stayed consistent in 2022 at 24%. And here, I'm quite happy to report that we do have research from Spain finding that 25 to 27% of young people aged 11 to 17 in Spain have spent real money to buy loot boxes. So these products are definitely very popular, including with children and young people. Now, what are the potential harms of loot boxes? I think there are 3 points I want to bring up. The first one is just the conceptual and structural similarity. To a lot of people, loot boxes feel like gambling. Now, I think the duck test applies here quite well. I do believe this actually translates in Spanish. So if something looks like a duck, it swims like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. To a lot of people, if you ask them on the street, if you describe a loot box and you ask them, is this gambling? They will probably say, yes, this is gambling. The second issue is, of course, that with traditional gambling, there are a lot of fallacies and decision-making biases that affect how people make decisions. For example, there is the gambler's fallacy. So imagine the roulette wheel. If the ball landed on red last time, a lot of people will like to think that next time it is more likely to land on black than it is to be landing on red because it landed on red last time. However, of course, that's not true. That mathematically, they are independent events, but these are the sort of decision-making fallacies that people like to make, and that affect how they spend money in relation to gambling. And we do see similar effect being used in relation to loot boxes. A good example would be the near miss. So with the slot machines, you might see that it would come down and show you a 7. And then on the second row, it will show you another 7. And then on the last one, it will show you, oh, it's going to be 7. But then it will switch to something else. We've seen this implemented in relation to loot boxes, in addition to just traditional gambling. Now, we don't have any studies saying that, yes, this is affecting how much money players are spending on loot boxes. But if it works in gambling, and it doesn't cost the companies, the video game companies, very much implemented in relation to loot boxes, I see that they are implementing them, and it's probably to their benefit. And then finally, there is this empirical link between problem gambling and loot box spending that I'm going to delve into in more detail now. Now, this is an effect found by Zendel and Karras back in 2018, that if a player has more severe self-reported problem gambling, so if they say that they have experienced more issues with gambling, then they are more likely to spend more money on video game loot boxes. Now, there are many different explanations for this particular effect that has been observed. It could be that problem gamblers, so vulnerable consumers, they've developed some issues through their participation of traditional gambling. Now they are spending more money on loot boxes because of them being more vulnerable to it. It is also possible that buying loot boxes is causing people to become problem gamblers. Now, I'm not saying that that is true, just that it is a possibility that could explain this particular effect. Now, there could also be many other potential explanations, such as these products just being more attractive to the same group of people. But if that is true, then that group of people would likely be vulnerable consumers that you might want to do a bit more about. Now, a critique of the loot box research from the psychology side that has been done is that they've all been so-called cross-sectional studies. What that means is they've only looked at one point in time. So they would have, say today, I ask all of you how much you've spent on loot boxes, and I ask you to complete a bunch of questions about gambling, and then I get a score of your problem gambling. This is how cross-sectional studies are done. It only looks at one point in time. But more recently, 2 longitudinal studies have been published. Now, these studies are different in that they will go to the same group of people. So just like this classroom, so I would ask you today, and then 6 months later, I'm going to come back. Unfortunately, I'm not coming back to Spain in 6 months, although I'd love to. And then I'll ask you the same questions again to see whether if you reported spending more money before, now you are experiencing more problem gambling, for example. This is how longitudinal studies are done. Now, 2 of those studies have since been done, one in Valencia, where they found that young people who reported spending more money on loot boxes did participate in traditional gambling more frequently 6 months later. There's also another study finding that young people, this is, I believe, in the US and Canada, that young people who spend more money on loot boxes did spend more money on traditional gambling as well 6 months later. So there does seem to be a quite robust effect between loot box engagement and engaging in traditional gambling. Now, I do want to criticize, shall we say, the psychology literature a little bit as well, in the sense that we don't actually know whether loot boxes potentially lead to practical harms. Now, we've had one study saying that loot boxes appear to be disproportionately purchased by psychologically distressed and vulnerable people. So if the players are experiencing more psychological distress, they were spending more money on loot boxes in that particular study. But we've also had another study finding that there's no association between how much a player spends on loot boxes and their mental well-being or their psychological distress. So more research is definitely needed. You hear this a lot from researchers. More research is needed, and it probably depends on how the data is analyzed. But at the moment, there is that very robust effect between loot box spending and problem gambling. However, just because that correlation exists doesn't mean that those players are necessarily experiencing harm in practice. Yes, they may be scoring highly on the problem gambling scale. That doesn't mean that just by engaging with loot boxes, many people are experiencing harm. In fact, my most recent study actually found a very weak positive correlation between how much people spend on loot boxes and their mental well-being, which challenges whether loot boxes, or rather, even though loot boxes are structurally and psychologically similar to gambling, there are things that are different between the two that we shouldn't just disregard. Now, turning then to the second part of this presentation, we're gonna now think about how these mechanics are regulated. There are basically, I would say, two different approaches. The first one is to regulate loot boxes as a form of traditional gambling, because of course, gambling laws already exist across the world. The second way to do this is to regulate loot boxes as loot boxes. So we recognize that they are novel products, and we regulate loot boxes with dedicated legislation. Now, regardless of which approach you choose, you can do this by using actual laws. So you can make new laws, or alternatively, you can rely on industry self-regulation. What industry self-regulation means is, for example, Apple would say that if you're going to put your game onto my app store, you have to comply with certain rules. Those rules are not law in a legal sense, but they do cause certain companies to behave in a certain way. But that's industry self-regulation. Now, as to whether loot boxes are gambling, now this has to do with how gambling is defined in law in different countries. Now, this is somewhat of an oversimplification, but there are generally three different elements as to how gambling is defined in law. The first being a stake. So in most countries, for something to be gambling, it is required that the player spend real world money to participate in this process. So that's the stake element. If you're not spending real world money, so for example, if you got the loot box for free by playing the game, that cannot be gambling under the law in most countries. Secondly, there is the chance element. So this process that you participated in needs to be randomized in some way. If you know exactly what you're going to get, it's obviously not a loot box and not gambling because there's no randomization. And then the third element, and this is where the law tends to fail because, like I said, with most of the loot boxes we care about, you spend money either directly or indirectly. And then secondly, of course, it is randomized. Otherwise, it's not a loot box that we don't care about. And then, so it's only at this third stage where the law tends to fail, because in most countries, it is required that the prize element, what you win from the loot box, be worth a real world monetary value. So it has to be transferable into real world money somehow. And usually it is taken to be satisfied if it is possible to transfer the rewards from one player to another. So that way of categorizing loot boxes with 4 different types is very applicable here. Now, laws do differ from country to country. Now, in Belgium, this is a country that if you go read media reports, they like to say it's the only country that banned loot boxes. But actually, that's not quite true. Loot boxes are banned in Belgium only because Belgian gambling law defines gambling differently. You remember I was talking about those 3 different elements. In Belgium, that third prize element doesn't exist. In Belgium, the law only says that the player needs to experience a gain or a loss of some sort. It doesn't have to be that they won something that is worth real world money. That is not a requirement in Belgium, which is why more loot boxes can be regulated as gambling in Belgium. Now, in most countries, England, in Spain, for example, only a very small minority of loot boxes would actually be gambling within the meaning of the law. This is because only in very few games can you transfer what you win from the loot box to another player. Only in those games are the loot box rewards worth real world money. So in most countries, loot boxes cannot really be regulated as gambling, most of them. There's a small minority that can be the ones where the rewards are transferable, but the gambling regulators in most countries would say, yes, those are gambling, but then they don't do anything about it. But that's just how it is. However, more recently in Austria, there has been court cases where the court has said that, yes, we're going to enforce gambling law like it is written. So if you have a game where the loot box offers rewards that can be transferred to a different player, then it is illegal gambling, and we're going to allow the player to get back the money that they spent on the loot boxes in that game. So the law has been enforced in Austria, but not in different other countries, even though that small minority of loot boxes would in law be gambling. And then finally, in the Netherlands, we had the situation where the gambling regulator tried to enforce the law, just like what happened in Austria. But the highest court struck down that decision, saying that actually loot boxes cannot be regulated using the gambling law framework. And instead, you need something else. Politicians in the Netherlands have suggested that they might be looking into new laws to address this particular court decision, because the court just decided that actually we don't want to apply the law in a certain way. Of course, in China, there are also countries that just do not see loot boxes as a form of gambling at all. Gambling is just seen as the traditional forms of the lotteries or going to an actual casino. And all the other times are just regulated using some other form of law, not with gambling law. So now I'm going to try the second part of this quiz. So let's see if this works out again. There we go. All right. So I think it's 10 questions, and the faster you answer, the more points you get. So you want to be correct, and you also want to be as fast as you can, but don't be too fast. Don't just randomly click. You're not going to get points that way. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to give it a little bit more just for everyone to join. See, there are some benefits to allowing your phone, right?
I know that.
It does take time. All right, I think I'm going to get started in about 5 seconds. All right, let's go. Oh, more people are joining. Is anyone still trying to join? Just raise your hand and I'll know. All right, cool. Let's go. Answer as quickly as possible, but try to do it correctly. So, embedded loot boxes in Belgium. Are they gambling or are they not gambling? Remember that gambling law is different in Belgium. The prize element, it does not require that the reward be transferable for it to satisfy gambling. So it can be rewards that are not transferable, that will still be gambling. Correct. It is indeed gambling. Right. Second question. Oh, players ready? Let's go. So embedded isolated loot boxes in Belgium. So these are the ones that the rewards cannot be transferred to other players. Belgium, remember, is the special country that's a little bit different from the how other countries regulate gambling. Yes, indeed, it is gambling. Now, Belgium is the only country, I would say, where both embedded and embedded isolated loot boxes are gambling. All right, question 3. So in the Netherlands, remember that the court struck down any decisions saying that loot boxes can be regulated as gambling. So the legal position is that they can no longer be regulated as gambling at all. All right, we'll try with the next one. So embedded isolated loot boxes, these are ones that you paid real world money to buy, and then you cannot transfer the rewards to someone else. Are they gambling or are they not gambling in the Netherlands? Remember, the law has been struck down, so gambling law cannot be used to regulate loot boxes at all in the Netherlands. It's not a gambling. Yes, that's right. Question 5. Okay, so this is England. So this is most countries. I was going to say something, but I decided not to say because it's going to come up as a different question. Yeah, you remember that in most countries, it is required that the reward be transferable to another player for that to be gambling. If it cannot be transferred, it is not in law gambling. Yes, embedded loot boxes will be gambling in the UK. That's correct. But the regulator hasn't really been enforcing the law. We know games implement that sort of loot box, but the gambling regulator just hasn't done anything about it. Next question. Embedded isolated loot boxes, so the ones that cannot be transferred to other players. It's not gambling, is correct. Remember, China is one of the countries that decided that we're going to regulate loot boxes as loot boxes. Gambling just means traditional gambling. What about embedded loot boxes in China? Correct. Like in most other countries where they would be gambling, remember. All right, and the last two questions are actually about Spain. What is the position under the law in Spain in relation to loot boxes? With the embedded type first. Actually, that's a bug. Ignore the third option. That was something I forgot to remove. I think the link would have taken you to the Danish gambling regulators saying that they do think that this particular type of loot box would be gambling, but they haven't actually done anything about it. But they do say in that particular post that it is indeed gambling. Correct. It should be gambling. Whether or not the regulators regulated it as gambling is a different question. Now, CSGO, as I'm sure you're aware, is perfectly playable in Spain, despite this. All right, last question. Embedded isolated loot boxes, so the ones that you cannot transfer to another player, you cannot cash out. Correct, it's not gambling. All right, and I think that is the end of that particular section. Who's Genshin player? Well done. Oh, Genshin player, you actually went down. It actually was Gacha Enjoyer who. I know I had Okay, right. So we did the filling the box bit. There's the link to join the same thing, but I've written it there. But yes, so you'll see that across the world, depending on which country you're looking at, even these two type of loot boxes, they might be gambling or they might not be gambling, depending on where you're looking at. Belgium is the special example. I'll go into that in a little bit more depth. But at the moment, as it stands, most countries tend to only say that embedded loot boxes would be gambling within the meaning of the law, whilst embedded isolated loot boxes will be perfectly fine. But with most video games, I'll remind you, the loot box would be an embedded isolated loot box and not an embedded loot box. These are in the small minority, although some very popular games do implement this particular type. And I'm thinking about CSGO and Dota 2 and those sort of things. So what I would say is that because the embedded loot boxes are in theory regulated as gambling already under the law, we don't care too much about those. What we are concerned about are the embedded isolated loot boxes, because they are, for all intent and purposes, just like embedded loot boxes. You are spending real world money to participate in a randomized process. Yes, you might not be winning money, but with most loot boxes, you cannot win money. Even in CSGO, if you open most loot boxes, you do not earn more money by opening loot boxes. Most of the time you will lose, and you lose quite a lot of money. But this specific type of loot box is not really regulated in most countries. So how do we regulate this particular type of loot box? Now, there are a range of different options. The most restrictive option would be to say that we're going to ban this particular mechanic. Now, this has been done in Belgium not through a new law, but through the application of pre-existing law, just because their gambling law is different. But that's the approach that Belgium has taken. It is also possible to just do nothing. A lot of countries are in the do nothing stage. Yes, we see this as a potential problem, but well, we're not going to think about it. But there are also many other middle ground approaches that could be taken in relation to loot boxes. You don't necessarily need to say we're going to ban them or do nothing about them. There are many different things that you can do in the middle, and those are the ones that I want to go into a bit more depth in. Now, China has, for example, required that if you're going to sell a loot box in your video game, you need to tell the player how likely it is for them to win different rewards. So you need to make so-called probability disclosures. This has now also been required in Taiwan, and South Korea will be requiring this from March of next year. So some places in Asia are putting this onto making new laws to say that this is something that you need to do. Now, these middle ground approaches might be better, at least I think, because they don't necessarily prevent companies from monetizing their video games in a specific way. If players want to spend money on loot boxes, they can. If video game companies want to make money through that way, they can. However, it does provide some sort of safety net. It does provide some consumer protection to the player. Now, there is something in public health. They've come up with a very nice ladder. You can look it up on Google if you want. It's got the Nuffield Public Health Ladder. Basically, what it says is, at the very top, you have options like eliminate choice. So you say that the consumer has no choice in this matter. They just cannot do certain things. Now, a lot of countries would take this approach, for example, with some of the harder drugs. They would just say, no, you can never do this. And this is what Belgium has more or less done with loot boxes. There are less restrictive options from banning it. For example, instead of saying eliminating choice, you can restrict choice. So you can make this product less accessible, but still available. And of course, at the very bottom, you have the do nothing approach, or just to monitor the current situation. But what I want to focus on is what you can do right there in the middle. So if we zoom in on that bit, there are actually a variety of different options. So for example, you can provide information, which is what you're doing in China. You're not preventing players from buying loot boxes. You're not preventing companies from selling loot boxes, but you're saying that companies need to at least provide some information. So hopefully players will be making a more informed purchasing decision. You can enable choice. So at the moment, with a lot of video games, the items that you can obtain from the loot box, they are exclusive to the loot box. You must engage with the loot box mechanic to get the nice item that you want. For example, in Genshin Impact, if you want the really nice character, you have to engage with the loot box mechanic in some way. You cannot just directly purchase that particular character if you want to. So enable choice would be to say that actually we will make all in-game items directly purchasable at a reasonable price. Something more that you can do would be, for example, to change what is the default option. In addition to making it possible that players can now buy all in-game items directly rather than trying to get them through the loot box, you can make that the normal way, or the default way of getting those items. And if the player would like to get them through the loot box as an alternative, they have to go through some extra steps. Now, all of these are steps that one can take, a country can take, to try to make loot boxes, I suppose, less appealing to players, and to make other options something that players will be more likely to choose. You can also do this through incentives or disincentives. You can ask companies to obtain a license to sell loot boxes, so that should make loot boxes more expensive. Although I know there are criticisms about trying to tax things like gambling more as compared to trying to tax something like cigarettes more, because with gambling, the harm comes from how much money is spent. So if you make it more expensive, the person experiencing harm will be just experiencing more harm, as compared to with tobacco or alcohol. If you tax those things more, the person would have less access to them, just because they now cannot afford to have as much as they wanted. It is, of course, also possible in a lot of countries. I'm not sure whether it's true in Spain, but a lot of countries offer a tax incentive to companies. So if you're a video game company, you can get some of your tax back as part of making this video game, because the government wants to encourage the making of video games. In England, for example, this is decided based on so-called cultural factors. So the game has to promote British values for it to be something that would obtain the tax relief. Or you have to hire people from England to work on the game. Maybe there's something similar like this in Spain, I'm not sure. But what you can do instead is to just change those requirements. You can say that actually you can obtain the tax relief if you don't put loot boxes in your game. It is possible. I'm not sure any government is going to do it, but it is possible. And this is just sort of a thought exercise to suggest to you that there are more options than just banning them. Now, I think it's very important that regardless of which one of those approaches is picked or is chosen, that how that particular measure has been implemented in practice is assessed and continually monitored. Just because one particular way of regulating loot boxes has been adopted in a country, it shouldn't be treated as the loot box problem having been solved in that country, as you will soon see. I will go through some examples from my research of how these different loot box regulations have worked or have not worked in most cases in some different countries. So 4 examples I'll go through. The first is the Belgium's ban on loot boxes, and then it's China's legal requirement that games make probability disclosures. Thirdly, we have the UK through industry self-regulation requiring that games make loot box probability disclosures. And then finally, there's the age rating organization's loot box presence warning labels. I'll explain what they mean when we get to. So the first one is Belgium. So Belgium, in theory, banned loot boxes. Now, I think I've said it multiple times already in this particular presentation that they did not make a new law to ban loot boxes. It just so happened that the previous gambling law that already existed regulated gambling in a certain way that would include all loot boxes. And so the gambling regulator said that, yes, any loot box that you have to spend real world money to buy, they are illegal gambling, because it is not actually possible to obtain a license to offer loot boxes as a form of traditional gambling from the Belgian gambling regulator. So the prevalence rate for loot boxes in Belgium should be 0%, right? The mechanic has been banned. We shouldn't see any of them in the country at all. We know that some companies have removed loot boxes from their games. So they used to sell loot boxes in Belgium in that particular game, but in Belgium now, you can no longer buy loot boxes in that particular game. We also know of some companies that have removed their games from Belgium because that game is so reliant on loot boxes to make money that it no longer made sense to offer that game in Belgium without loot boxes. So the question was, can I still find loot boxes in Belgium? And the answer is yes. Yes, I can. So I flew to Belgium last year. As part of my research, I get to travel and play video games. I played the 100 highest grossing games. Not as fun as it sounds, because most of them are match 3 games. I've gotten quite good at them. 82 of the 100 games were still selling loot boxes in Belgium. And this is despite a ban having been imposed by the gambling regulator. This happens to be higher than how prevalent they were in the UK, but disregard that particular point. That could just be down to random chance. But it's important to just note that loot boxes are still very much present in Belgium. Here are 2 screenshots showing you that, yes, you see it was being sold in euros because that's what they use in Belgium. And this is how you pay for stuff on the iPhone. If I actually click the button on the side of my phone twice, I would have committed a crime in Belgium, because Belgium is one of the few countries in the world that still criminalizes participation in illegal gambling. So I know that buying this loot box is illegal. So had I done it, I would have been committing a crime. I think I could be sentenced to 2 years in jail. So I didn't actually press the buttons, but you can very much see that loot boxes are still available in Belgium. Now, we can't know how many games were removed from the Belgian store because they can no longer be found through this particular research. And it is true that some games, when I was doing the research, I can no longer find them on the Belgian version of the store. That's true. And it does seem that the more reputable, so the bigger companies, they tended to have complied with the ban by removing loot boxes or removing their games. But at the moment with the app stores, most of the most popular games are coming from China, Finland, and Israel. And the compliance rate from companies in those countries is not particularly high. Quite interestingly, there were 2 games that actually were still available for download, and they were top grossing games, but they did something to try to prevent Belgian players from spending money on loot boxes. So in one game, this is a social casino game. If you try to buy anything inside this game, whether it's a loot box or whether it's just anything, it would give you this pop-up window saying you can no longer buy virtual items in Belgium, yada yada. So you can't buy anything in this particular game anymore. But this actually doesn't make sense because this game was on the list of highest grossing games. So it was making a lot of money in Belgium somehow. And at the same time, it is not possible to buy anything in Belgium in this particular game. That doesn't make any sense. But the second example, I think, would explain why this has happened. So if you go into the shop in this particular game in Belgium, it will show you absolutely nothing, no products available. However, if you are still in Belgium, so with this one, you will be showing a Belgian IP address. But if you are still in Belgium, but you turn on VPN, so you can spoof yourself to say that I'm actually coming in from Japan, then boom, everything appears in the shop. So all you had to do was turn on VPN to be able to buy loot boxes in this particular game. And so this, I think, explains why, even though you cannot buy things in Belgium in this game, it is still a highest grossing game because players are circumventing that ban, even circumventing these technical measures because it is so easy to do. Because, if you watch any YouTube videos, I think most of them are now sponsored by a NordVPN or what have you, and you have to use that VPN to do other things. It is safer for you to use the VPN for data protection purposes. Maybe you want to watch more shows on Netflix, etc. So you might already have a VPN on without you knowing, and then you can buy loot boxes despite this ban and despite a company actively trying to comply with the law. Now, another quite interesting example was Diablo Immortal, a very, very controversial mobile version of the classic Diablo series. It reportedly did not release in Belgium. So this game released when I was in Belgium. And it is true that when I tried to look for the game on the Belgian store, I couldn't find it. It's true. It was not available in Belgium. And very widely reporting in the media. However, this was also me in Belgium holding, as you will see, a copy of Diablo Immortal on my phone, because all I had to do was change the country setting on my phone. I was still very much in Belgium. All I had to do was say, actually, I'm not in Belgium. I'm in, I think I said I was in the UK. And I was then able to access the UK store from Belgium and download the game and play it and buy loot boxes and do whatever I want. So the takeaway from that is that most games were still offering loot boxes, 82% in fact. Very few games try to do something to prevent people from buying loot boxes, but those technical measures were very easy to circumvent. Just use the VPN and you can break it. And then finally, even removing a game from a country doesn't work. And I would say that with loot boxes, we are most concerned about the players who are most dedicated to the game. So they really want to play the game. Now, with those players, if you try to remove one game from one country, that is really not going to work. They will just obtain that game in some other way and play it anyway, with a VPN or installing the game with the Android installation file or whatever they would like to do. It's just so easy. So was the Belgian ban on loot boxes successful? I am quite critical of this banning approach because especially when it is not enforced like it has not been in Belgium. Because what has happened in Belgium, in my opinion, is that the regulator gave players and parents a false impression that they are now safe because the regulator has said that, oh yes, all of these mechanics are banned. And people would start to think that, oh, okay, well, I don't have to worry about this. For example, a parent might not speak to their child anymore about loot boxes, thinking that this problem has been solved in Belgium. But that is simply not true. It's probably worse than doing nothing at all, as I say, because in a country where these things are not banned or regulated, a parent might be more conscious and would actually have that conversation with their child. So some takeaways from this particular failure. I had the chance to have a chat with the Belgian regulator, and the Belgian Minister of Justice also responded to this particular finding. But basically, it is just down to the regulator not having enough funding, because on just the Apple platform alone, we're looking at 1 million video games. You cannot expect a national gambling regulator to look at 1 million games and finding the ones that are breaking the law. So perhaps another way of regulating this would be to shift that burden onto the platforms. For example, it can say that Apple, you need to get all your games to comply with the law, and if you don't, the country can instead go after the platform rather than individual game companies based in China or in Finland or wherever they are based. And also, the second takeaway, and this relates somewhat to the Spanish situation, because of course there's that draft law that will come down to, but is another country's gambling regulator going to be better than Belgium's at enforcing the law? Because in my opinion, if the same measure is adopted by another country, you have the same result, just because banning loot boxes or trying to ban loot boxes on mobile platform is not going to work. It's not realistic. The third takeaway for me is perhaps that what policymakers need to do is instead just say that, yes, we recognize that we cannot regulate against all 1 million games on the iPhone platform. But what we will do is we will look at the 500 most popular games, and we will actively monitor those games, and we'll ensure that those games are compliant. Because of how concentrated spending on video games is, most players will be spending money on the most popular games. So if you just look at the 500 games, you should be able to capture most of the spending on loot boxes. So this would be a more effective strategy than just pretending to ban loot boxes and giving that false impression to people, my opinion. The second measure that I want to talk about is these so-called probability disclosures. So these tell players how likely it is for them to obtain different items. You see on the left-hand side, this I believe is from AFK Heroes, something like that. You get a 2.61% chance of getting an elite tier hero. We call this a category-based disclosure because it does not actually tell you what your probability of obtaining a specific hero belonging to the elite tier is. Now, it's unlike this particular probability disclosure. Now, this one is an item-based one. So this one tells you that exactly for Mario Happy is 1%, even though all of this and all of this falls into the high-end category. So if you were making a category-based disclosure, what you'll be doing is just saying that high-end ones have a certain probability and not giving all of this information. In my opinion, this is obviously better because players care about exactly what their chances are for getting a specific item is, rather than just broadly how likely it is for them to get something that falls into a rarity category. Now, so China, as I mentioned, at the time that we did our research, was the only country to have required loot box probability disclosures by law. Other places are also implementing similar measures, but in pretty much every other part of the world, this probability disclosure thing is already required by industry self-regulation. I mentioned earlier how on the Apple platform, Apple would say that if you want to put your game onto my platform, you need to make probability disclosures. The same thing is done by the Google Play Store and also by all of the major publishers. So EA, etc., Ubisoft, they would say that if you want to publish your game with us, you need to make probability disclosures. Now, what happened was when we looked at how likely it was for companies to comply, in China, the compliance rate was 95.6%. So nearly all games that had loot boxes in made probability disclosures. But in contrast, in the UK, when we looked at the situation, only 2/3 of games made probability disclosures, 1/3 didn't. And so to me, this suggests that industry self-regulation doesn't work quite as well as legal regulation. Just saying that something is required is not going to work. You need to also actively enforce your rules. So if you say that probability disclosures are required and a company is not making them, you need to delist that company or somehow otherwise force them to make probability disclosures, because otherwise you're allowing something that's breaking the rules onto your platform. Now, another quite interesting aspect about probability disclosures is just how they're implemented. So we've seen some good examples like this one. This is a loot box, and it will tell you what your probabilities are just at the page, on the page where you buy the loot box. This is the button you press to buy the loot box. This is a good one. It quite obviously shows you what your probabilities are. However, we had other examples where it was just worse. Now, in this game, for example, this is the loot box, right? You buy the loot box by clicking the buy button, but you don't see the probability disclosure. This is what you see by default. What you have to do is you have to engage with this particular button. So you actually have to touch it, and then this pop-up window would appear. And this will tell you what the probabilities are. It says 20%, 10%, 5%, etc. But what happens with this particular example is a lot of games do this. You have to touch something for the probability disclosure to show up. But in this game, just touching it doesn't work. You actually have to hold your finger over it for this pop-up window to appear. As soon as you let go, this disappears. I was only able to capture this because I took a screenshot. But remember that this is a phone screen, so your finger is about probably wider than my arm. So if you actually was trying to put your finger here, holding onto this button, you block out most of the probabilities. So it's obviously not well thought through or designed, and it doesn't help the consumer. We also had examples like this one. This is in one of the Sims games. That doesn't add up to 100%. We're missing 0.4%, and we do not know what happens 0.4% of the time. So this is obviously inaccurate, right? We have no guarantee that the probability disclosures are accurate, even when they do add up to 100%. But this is obviously not good. We've had ones like this one, where it was just say that it is somewhere between 0.5% and 2%. Now that's a 4-time difference. On average, you need to spend 4 times as much money to get that item, depending on which side of that range the actual probability is. This is not actually telling the player what their chances are. This is just telling them a range. This is another poor example where the probability for obtaining 1,000 gold is 2.52252%. I believe this list had more than 100 different items on it. So something like this is going to be very hard for players to understand, especially you remember that a lot of young people are trying to look at this and trying to understand how likely or unlikely they are to obtain certain rare items. I really do not understand why there needs to be so many decimal points. But this is probably the worst example. The probabilities are 1 million divided by the amount of soul stones to the 1.5 power. So you literally need to plug in your amount of soul stones into this formula, and then it also changes depending on which one you're looking at. And I don't understand it. I feel like most people wouldn't be able to understand. And also, of course, with these games designed for children, parents are trying to understand the information without having played the game. And most parents, honestly, every parent will not be able to understand what this is trying to say. This is another one. I like showing this example because this game exists in real life. You can go to a real life casino. Don't go to a real life casino, but you can go to a real life casino and play this game where you would throw 3 dice, and then depending on what they land on, you get different amounts of money. Now, in real life, if you throw 3 dice, the probability of all 3 dice landing on the same face is the same. So the probability of landing on 1, 1, 1 is the same on landing on 6, 6, 6 in real life. Not in this video game. In this video game, 666 has a 1.05 chance of happening, while this 111 has an 8.5% chance of happening. So without that probability disclosure, players would automatically assume that what they know in real life is true, but it is not actually true. So probability disclosures, I think, do bring some benefits as long as we can be assured that they are accurate, easily accessible, and simple to understand. Don't design video games like this, okay? This is just going to fool people into spending money. So just on the probability disclosure point, this is when I want to talk a bit more about the Spanish draft law. We'll talk a bit more about it, I think, during the Q&A session when the recording is closed off. But there is the relevant articles of the draft law there in Spanish. I've translated them, so I read them. I've read the translated version. You can read the originals. But basically, the regulator would have required them in very specific ways. So they had the power to say that you need to make probability disclosures in a specific way. And that is useful because that can guarantee that there is one way of making them across the industry. So if someone decides to play a new game, they don't have to relearn how to access probability disclosure. Now, so I do believe this solves that problem that we identified earlier about all of the different ways that probability disclosures could be made. One further study that we did that was quite interesting with probability disclosures is in China, we asked players how likely. So did you see the probability disclosures? And after seeing the probability disclosures, how much money did you spend? Did you spend more money? Did you spend less money? The idea is, of course, that after seeing the probability disclosures, the player is supposed to spend less money. But what we found was that 72.4% of players, so that's most players, said that their spending behavior didn't change. The probability disclosure didn't do anything. We had about 20% saying that they did buy fewer loot boxes, so this is good. But we also had 10% or so saying that they actually spent more money on loot boxes after seeing the probability disclosure. Now, that might seem silly, but I don't think it actually is, because with some video games, what they offer is a mechanic where if you spend money buying 10 loot boxes, if you do not get a rare item with the first 9 loot boxes, you are guaranteed to get one on the 10th one. So if you read the probability disclosure, it is possible that, say you originally only planned on buying 8 loot boxes, but you read the probability disclosure telling you that if you buy 2 more, you're guaranteed to get one, you might actually end up spending more money as a result of that so-called pity mechanic, which might be what some of you are familiar with. So this is, of course, not a representative study in the sense that we just randomly asked about 900 Chinese players. There were not Chinese players of specific age groups or anything like that. But I think this is something to consider. Do probability disclosures work at all in practice at reducing spending? Now, finally, we're going to talk about the label introduced by the ESRB and PEGI. So the ESRB is the Entertainment Software Ratings Board in North America. They provide age ratings for video games. So if the game is more violent or whatever, it will get a higher age rating. PEGI does the same thing in Europe. I put the label in Spanish there. So this is what you should have seen if you looked at any video games with loot boxes released more recently. But what they did was in 2020, both organizations said that, oh yeah, we recognize the loot boxes is an issue that some people are concerned about. So if a game has loot boxes in, we're going to put this label on. And it says in-game purchases includes random items. Quite importantly, it doesn't say loot boxes, it doesn't say gacha, it doesn't say any of the words that a player will be familiar with to describe loot boxes. It says in-game purchases includes random items, which is just a completely newly invented term. So where would you be able to find this? So you can find it on the back of the physical packaging, or you can, with PEGI, go onto their website and search for the game title, and you'll be able to find the label on that website. So here is a what you can see with FIFA 23. So this was the last FIFA game. Now you see it's not on the front, so it's not very prominent. You can't. It could have been here, but it's not here. Instead, you have to turn it the other way around. Look at the back, and then it's over there at the bottom. And you zoom in, and it does say it. So if you know what you're looking for, you can find it, but it's not prominently shown. On the website, of course, you can search for it. And the study that I did was to look at whether the ESRB and PEGI decided that the same game had loot boxes in. Games don't change from region to region. So if it has loot boxes in one place, it should have loot boxes in the other. So they should be rating them consistently. So with FIFA, they were consistent. Both organizations decided that, yes, this game had loot boxes. But with other games, you have situations like this, where PEGI would say that, yes, this game contains loot boxes, but the ESRB would say, no, we don't know this game contains loot boxes. So this game does contain loot boxes, I can tell you. So this is just inaccurate information being provided by the age rating organization. So the study was basically looking at the games that they both rated, and I found 5 games were missing the label. So with one organization, so one of the organizations failed to identify that the game had loot boxes in, and failed to inform the consumer about the presence of loot boxes in that particular game. I had a pre-registered rate saying that the consistency rate should be 95%, and if it's lower than that, I'm not happy. And we found it to be 83.9%. Not too interesting. What is interesting is that we don't actually know how many games there were that were not rated as containing loot boxes by both people. This research relied on one of the organizations saying that the game had loot boxes in for me to say that the other one didn't find loot boxes in. But if both of them didn't find loot boxes in, but the game had loot boxes in, I wouldn't be able to find it. And it just so happens that after this study, I talked to Peggy about how they're rating all of these games. And Peggy fined two companies 5,000 euros each for failing to tell Peggy that the game contained loot boxes. One of those games was Diablo Immortal, which you'll remember was not released in Belgium, all of that. But that fine is actually really ridiculous because it was 5,000 euros and Diablo Immortal made over 480 million euros in the 1 year since it released. And in that 1 year, it did not have the loot box label attached to it. So the fine was 0.001% of how much money this game has generated. That is not effective regulation, put simply. Compared to, for example, with the GDPR, if you breach the GDPR, you are liable for a fine that is up to millions. And indeed, it is potentially 4% of your global turnover. So however much money you are making across the world, 4% of that is what the EU can fine you if you're in breach of the GDPR, compared to 0.001%, which is what Peggy, which is an industry self-regulator, is doing. Another study we did related to this has to do with how this label is implemented on the Google Play Store. Now, you'll see that both the ESRB and Peggy implement the same thing because they use the International Age Rating Coalition system. So what happens is if you go onto the Google Play Store and you look for a game, you can see the age rating. And if you tap on the little I button there, you get this pop-up window telling you that this game contains loot boxes. So in the US, it will show you the ESRB rating, but if you look at it from the Spanish store, it will show you the Peggy rating. But regardless of which age rating a system it uses, it will show you the loot box label because that's shown consistently. So I looked at 100 video games, very popular video games, to see, I know that all of these games had loot boxes in them, to see whether they were labeled as containing loot boxes on the Google Play Store. And 71 of them were not labeled. The explanation from the ESRB was that we didn't start implementing this measure since February 2022, and any games that were rated before February 2022 did not have to comply. That is, it doesn't make any sense because even today, if you look at the most popular games that are making the most amount of money on mobile platforms, nearly all of them were released before February 2022. It is very hard for a new game to break into the most popular games. So this basically said that if you're an old game that is still popular, you do not need to comply with the law. Well, with the self-regulation rather. My reaction to that particular explanation. Since speaking with the ESRB and Peggy, we've managed to get 77 of 84 games labeled. So now if you go onto Google Play Store, the label will be there. But I highlight this because you see that it's 77 of 84. It's not 84 of 84. This happened because the IARC actually thought that some games that I said had loot boxes in, they disagreed. Some of the disagreements were perhaps arguable in the sense that it is quite complicated to understand how the loot box mechanic works. We can discuss this perhaps in a little bit, whether the eggs in Pokemon Go is or is not a loot box. We can talk about that. But the issue is that what is a loot box exactly doesn't seem to be something that people tend to agree on. There is some good agreement, but it's not a perfect agreement, even with the age rating organization. The Peggy's response to that particular study on the Google Play Store was that the Google Play Store is very hard to regulate, just like what happened in Belgium with the Apple Store. There are 1 million games, we can't be expected to look at all of them, etc., etc. And it has been suggested that on the stores that had fewer games, it is possible that it will just be easier to regulate. So instead of 1 million games, you might instead be looking at about 200 games on the Microsoft Store or on the Nintendo Store, etc. So I went and fact-checked that particular assertion that they made by looking at the Epic Store, the Microsoft Store, the Nintendo Store, and the PlayStation Store. And you'll see that the compliance rate is indeed better On Microsoft, on Sony, they're reasonably high. Nintendo, not very good. And on the Epic Store, it was 7.1%. Only one game that had loot boxes in actually implemented, actually had the label. So it seems that even that particular assertion is not correct. 7.1% is just quite ridiculous. Even today, it's not implemented properly. If you don't have this implemented, you shouldn't be advertising that you've implemented this. One final thing I think about the particular warning label is that a team in Australia, they've done a study in lab settings, asking people to look at the label and trying to say what they understood from this label. And they found that most consumers do not understand this label. And I'm not surprised because it doesn't use any language that a player or a parent will be familiar with. If you search for includes random items, it could just, to someone who doesn't understand exactly what this label means, it could just mean, oh, I can, in this game, defeat enemies and obtain random loot. Now, that's not what we're talking about, but it could be that, if they just look at what's in the brackets. The sort of conclusion with the industry self-regulation in general, I think, is I don't have a particular high opinion of them. They don't seem to work in most situations. Consumers can't rely on either the probability disclosure requirement or the warning labels. So we cannot just assume that because the industry said that we're going to do something, that they have done something. You actually need to go and check whether they have done what they have said that they've done. Because in most situations, as we found, they haven't actually done what they said they would do. So regardless of what kind of rules are adopted, just coming back to the point that I made earlier, it doesn't matter how you decide to regulate loot box. You need to make sure to check whether or not whatever you have required is actually being complied with by different companies. Now, a lot of different countries are considering different ways of regulating loot boxes. In Finland, there was a bill where they wanted to change how lotteries are defined in the law, so that what they would do is they would actually copy the Belgian definition of gambling. So back to the embedded isolated thing, all of the embedded isolated loot boxes, which cannot be regulated as gambling in Finland at the moment, could then be regulated as gambling in Finland had this law proposal went through. But this has since died. It hasn't been reproposed again. In Brazil, there is a similar bill that wants to expand what gambling means, and that would then include loot boxes. There's actually, funnily enough, another bill in Brazil that just says that loot boxes need to make probability disclosure. So those two bills are obviously in conflict with each other. You can't have one bill saying that loot boxes are illegal gambling, whilst another bill saying that loot boxes need to make probability disclosure, which of course assumes then that loot boxes are legal and not illegal gambling. In Austria, we've had the court case starting to enforce the law. However, I've since found that in Austria, in the same country, but in different regions, courts have actually come to different conclusions. In another region of Austria, they actually decided that actually no, loot boxes are not illegal gambling. So we're not quite sure exactly what the position would be in Austria. In the US, there were a bunch of state laws proposed. One of them was to require a warning label that kind of read like a tobacco or alcohol warning that actually said that loot boxes will lead to gambling addiction, etc., etc. I thought that one went a bit too hard, but that bill has also died, so it's not under consideration. But this just shows you the wealth of different approaches that countries could consider and are considering. And just to end, I think just beyond video game loot boxes, there are also other things that we need to be concerned about. I had one of the examples, which was the NFT video games, right? With other gambling-like products, with the trading card packs and whatnot, are they gambling? Are they not gambling? What should we do about them, if anything? And also with crypto gambling in general, just because of how quickly the value of cryptocurrency fluctuates. Just holding on to and having any cryptocurrency is arguably some form of gambling. But I think just gamblification, this process of products starting to implement or involve some sort of randomization, is a trend that we see beyond just video games. Although perhaps it's of less interest, but I do think we're seeing more products that now involve randomization. I was at a Subway. So one of those places where you go get a sandwich, and even they were offering a prize draw if I bought a sandwich to get different things depending on my luck, apparently. But yeah, so to end on some questions that we can perhaps talk about, which would be what are the benefits or disadvantages of the different approaches that different countries have taken. Yep, I'll end the presentation there and happy for any question, perhaps after a break, because I need to use the toilet.
Thank you very much.